Enchanted Portals is a 2D platformer and run-and-gun shooter. It's no secret that this game was heavily inspired by another game called Cuphead, which also had a similar cartoonish art style and run-and-gun arcade-style gameplay. But putting all the comparisons to Cuphead to one side, I want to judge the game on its own merits in this review. So let's start with the story. The story in Enchanted Portals is almost non-existent. It's very minimal and it's told to us through mostly static images. The only fully animated cutscene that we get is at the very start of the game. And I understand that this game was built on a lower budget, but it would have been nice to have seen some more cutscenes to tell the story. We play as two rookie wizards, Bobby and Penny, and they accidentally unleash a powerful spellbook that they shouldn't have been messing with. The spellbook releases all kinds of different monsters and bosses across various worlds. It's a very basic premise that allows us to have context for why we are going to these different worlds and why we are fighting against various different bosses. The game's presentation and art style is honestly a bit of a mixed bag. The game looks great at times with some really creative and interesting looking levels and bosses, but some of the game honestly looks really unpolished and unfinished with some much lower quality assets and lower quality animation. The overall art direction of the game feels very inconsistent, and while I do appreciate the amount of variety that we see with some of these levels and some of these bosses, it doesn't all quite come together. When it comes to the sound design, honestly the sound effects are not very good in this game. They sound very generic and very stock.
You know, it sounds too stock, it sounds too normal to me.
But some of the music in the game is actually pretty good. A lot of the sound effects for things such as casting spells and taking damage honestly sound like they've taken from a free sound library or something like that. But I did enjoy some of the music and found that it helped to give some of the levels a lot of personality. You'll spend most of the game doing 2D run and gun levels, with the world ending in a boss battle. Honestly, most of these run and gun levels are not particularly good. They feel complete random with projectiles spawning across the screen. And you can't really learn these levels or learn patterns because they're so heavily random. I also found that these levels just go on for way too long and they get pretty boring because there's not enough variation in gameplay during these levels. And there are so many enemies and projectiles that are constantly thrown at you, it just becomes very tedious. The boss battles are far more fun and they're a lot better, but you're gonna have to work hard to get to them because you need to complete these run and gun levels in order to reach the boss battle at the end. You're able to use 3 different spells in the game: fire, ice, and wind. A couple of levels do have color-coded enemies where you will need to use ice, fire, or wind depending on what color the enemy is surrounded by. The wind spell does have a nice spread effect, which might be good for clearing out multiple enemies at once, but for the most part, I felt that I only really needed to use the fire spell as it does the most damage. The ice spell felt basically pointless, aside from the levels where we have to use the ice spell in order to defeat blue enemies. The basic controls for jumping and shooting feel fine for the most part, but the problems I do have with the controls come in when we are doing the dash maneuver through the air and also using the parry or block move. This block move puts a bubble around the player, which can come in handy sometimes for blocking attacks, but it feels like there's such a massive cooldown on using it, and the same goes for the air dash. It feels as though we should be able to do it more frequently, and I end up getting hit because of the fact that I'm not able to use it where it feels like I should be able to. Something else that I found really troublesome with the controls is the fact that when we switch weapon, we have to begin firing our weapon again, as if we have the weapon held down previously, then the weapon will stop firing. This might not sound like a big deal, but it really gets in the way when you're trying to fight against something and you want to change weapon. It just feels really stiff and clunky from a control perspective. In terms of replay value, the game doesn't have very much aside from some achievements for beating the game on insane difficulty. You're also able to play the game in 2-player co-op, but I wasn't able to do so for this review. I think it'd be pretty great if the developers introduced a boss rush mode or something like that in a patch or an expansion DLC later down the line, as the boss battles are certainly the best part of the game. And it'd be quite a nice addition to just play the bosses whenever we want to from a menu or some sort of boss rush mode. The game has no unlockable items or weapons. You're just stuck with the 3 spells and the shield spell for the entire game. And this kind of feels like there's not so much progression through the game, as you're stuck with the same loadout as you have at the beginning of the game all the way through till the end. You never really earn anything or unlock anything, and that's kind of disappointing. In conclusion, Enchanted Portals feels unpolished and underdeveloped. Sure, some of the bosses are pretty fun, but you're going to have to work extremely hard to reach those bosses due to the game's heavy focus on the 2D run and gun levels. It's a very inconsistent game, and whilst there are some really great ideas here and some really great boss battles, they are buried under all of the game's problems. It's pretty rough around the edges, but I can clearly see what the developers were trying to do here, and I do appreciate that this is a 2-person team, but perhaps they've bitten off more than they could chew with a game like this. My hope is that with a patch, some of the control issues I had with the game can be sorted out, as well as some of the random enemies spawning on some of these run and gun levels being toned down a bit. There are some really creative ideas here, but it just needed a lot more refinement and perhaps a bit longer time in development. I'm glad that I was given the opportunity to give the game a chance and see the whole thing through to completion. I wanted to say a massive thanks once again to Perp Games for providing me with a review code for the game. What do you guys think of Enchanted Portals? Let me know in the comments. This has been Bradman, this has been Enchanted Portals, and I am out.